Good morning, good afternoon, wherever today's webinar may find you. My name is Sara Rouhi, and I'll be leading today's discussion on funding under pressure with the Defend Research Group. We have almost 200 people registered for this, which is great. I'm sure many of you were on the Stand Up for Science session yesterday, so some of you might be webinared out, but thanks for being here. We want to give folks a couple more minutes. We'll probably start at 2 minutes past, just to give folks a chance to join us from the myriad locations that we have attendees registered from. While we wait, if folks could just pop in the chat your name, location, maybe what hat you wear day to day. If you do not feel safe or comfortable doing that, no problem, no need to respond, and feel free to change your name in the attendee list if you'd like that to stay anonymous. And I'm actually just seeing my first note taker, so I'm actually going to ask that note takers be disabled. So I'm very sorry, fireflies.ai, but I am going to remove you. I don't know what happens when I do that. Okay, yeah, so I'm going to remove any note takers just in the interest of confidentiality and having a little bit of control over the messaging here. However, correct me if I'm wrong, co-organizers, we can provide a transcript. So if you wanted to take notes, we can provide the transcript, and your magical computer friend can turn that into notes if that would be helpful. So thanks for your patience with that. So we're just going to give folks one more minute. Feel free to drop in your name, your location, what hat you're wearing. And if you wish to remain anonymous, you can always just change your rename yourself in your participants chat, and we won't see any identifying information. All right, so I will try to keep an eye on this. Really nice to see some familiar names and faces. Tony, Yvette, welcome. And to folks who are maybe newer to this group, we're really excited to have you. So with that, we're at 75, which is as good as anything. So really delighted that everyone's here. As I mentioned, good morning, good afternoon. We will kick off today's conversation, Funding Under Pressure, Political Influence, Censorship, and the Future of Research, with Doctors Michael Green and Jeremy Berg. My name is Sara Rouhi. I'm a founding member of the Defend Research Group and the moderator for today's session. Just a couple quick housekeeping notes. We are recording this. We will stop the recording at the open Q&A, just so people can feel a little bit more comfortable. Feel free to update your name, as I stated, in the participants section of your Zoom panel in case you don't want to be identified. And we will also share the recording via YouTube. If you have an AI note taker, please turn it off. Otherwise, I'll turn it off on our side. We're just trying to keep a little bit of a sense of where the information is going, but we're happy to provide a transcription afterwards. And we would be remiss to not thank Scholastica, our friends at Scholastica, the scholarly journal infrastructure provider, for enabling the Zoom infrastructure for today's session, and the volunteer network that is slowly but surely building to support our work. A big thank you to those folks as well. So before we dive into the discussion, I'd like to just briefly introduce the Defend Research Group and the work that we did. And you'll have to pardon me if we have to go on somewhat of a painful journey back in time. If anyone can remember, February 2025, the list of words that was, well, I think the banned list of words started actually January 7, or the first day of the new administration. But by February, a number of us working in the scholarly communication space were really quite horrified to see the lack of engagement by many of the stakeholders, whether it was publishers, academic institutions, administrators, funders, libraries, not only not standing up, but actually anticipating and complying in advance before anything had really come down the pike. So this list of words has actually been compiled by the PEN America team, who actually did a webinar with us earlier this year. So if you're interested in seeing more about that, check out their site or check out our webinar page on our site. But they track on a daily basis the words that are being banned, how they're being banned, and they're doing a lot of important work around censorship. So this group of 5, under the leadership of Lisa Schiff, came together to first just express frustration and come together in community and solidarity. And then it became very clear that without any kind of grassroots effort, we could not really count on our employers or our institutional affiliations to engage in this kind of work. So you'll see all of us identify with our orchids. We come from many different aspects of the scholarly communication ecosystem, but none of our employers can permit us to affiliate with them. So you can find us on LinkedIn, you can find our org IDs, but we do not actually affiliate in any way with our work. All of this is work as private citizens in our own time. And I see there is another AI assistant, so I'm going to see if I can turn that off, or if Siobhan, you're able to turn that off, that would be great too. I'll try and see if I can sort it out in a moment. All right. So because we're professionals working in academia, in libraries and publishers, we really focus on censorship in academic inquiry specifically. It's very easy to lose sight of what can feel like something of a niche issue amidst the blitzkrieg of attacks on science funding, higher education that's happened in the last 18 months. So while censorship may feel niche, there are many other places that are covering the challenges around attacks on just scientific institutions, higher ed. The recent, I think most of us are still reeling from the announcement from OMB around politics actively intruding upon the assessment of grants. Many of us have been talking about that. So the focus on censorship is shining light on a specific piece that can sometimes be lost amidst the wash of other things we're trying to pay attention to in this moment. So the defendresearch.org group started as a declaration, an open petition asking people to sign the declaration to defend research from US government censorship. That is still an open declaration. We encourage you to sign it. We have over 5,000 signatories globally, many of whom are research institutions, publishers, overseas. Folks who are based in the US, unfortunately, often cannot affiliate with their institutions, but we encourage you to sign the declaration, or at least take a look at the declaration, consider signing it, and share it if you are committed to the acts that we encourage you to take by participating. So we're really thinking about censorship specifically. If you engage with us, we're going to be amplifying and hopefully accelerating the work that similar organizations and individuals are doing, like Jeremy, like Michael, like Stand Up for Science, PEN America. So if you visit our site, you'll be able to tap into those resources there. And just, probably not saying anything new given the affiliations that many of you have posted already just in the chat. But the way censorship is showing up is variable and extensive. So the cutting funding, eliminating publications, eliminating data based on banned words, disappearing research from government websites, restricting where authors come from and who researchers can publish with, and then just firing faculty, eliminating departments, eliminating colleges because they are contrary to administration priorities. This is becoming the norm. And just to give you a taste of what this feels like as someone working in the US every day, this is just news from like the last week. So teaching restrictions have prompted half of Texas Tech to alter their syllabi. You'll notice there's something of a memorial. There are like funeral protests and memorials happening all over Texas at universities for the death of academic freedom. PNAS, Chronicle of Higher Education, the emergency meeting last night run by Stand Up for Science around taking action against the OMB proposal that I mentioned earlier. Internationally, the politicization of grant funding is obviously sparking a lot of concern abroad, given the international nature of scientific collaboration. And the administration's getting creative. You can use immigration policy to suppress speech. You can use lawsuits. There's many different tools. They're pulling on as many levers as they can. And that's why today's session is really about understanding the scope of that and hopefully closing with some hopeful notes and some reminders of the way that you can take action to fight back and resist these increasingly problematic attacks on science and academic freedom. So our site is full of resources and things you can do. The QR code takes you directly to the declaration if you want to read it and sign it. One of the conversations we're going to have in our July and August webinars is really about the question of risk. So if you're a white man with a tenure track job in the UK, sign away. If you're a brown woman on an H-1B visa in the US, maybe don't sign, right? So take a moment to assess your risk profile and know that if you can't sign, there are many other ways to engage in the defend research work. So with that, it is my pleasure to kick off this conversation with Jeremy and Michael. And I'd like to start by sort of telling about the story of how we sort of came into each other's orbits. A lot of the conversation around this work is happening on Blue Sky. You'll see at the bottom of the screen both Michael and Jeremy's Blue Sky handles as we move through the presentation. Jeremy is a frequent poster. He is very active in pushing back publicly. You talk about someone who's able to use their privilege to be loud in support of folks who are perhaps unable to. Jeremy has been a very loud critic of the current administration, particularly things that are happening at NIH, given his background. He and Michael were connecting because Michael is one of the early career researchers who saw his grant canceled. And when I reached out to Jeremy on Blue Sky out of nowhere, he was generous enough to respond. He connected us with Michael because the two of them had been on a podcast where Michael was talking about his experience, and NIH head Bhattacharya was shockingly dismissive as to the impact of a grant being canceled for an early career researcher. And all of that triggered this conversation and discussion around the analysis that Jeremy's been doing, looking at canceled grants, and then Michael speaking to how this really affects you on the ground day to day as a researcher who is just trying to do good science. So with that, Jeremy's got a couple slides. Michael's got some info he wants to share. We're going to have a discussion after that. In the meantime, pop your questions in the Q&A box. Get going in the chat. I'm going to pull in stuff from the chat as we go. And then once we get to the Q&A, we'll stop the recording and let it rip from there. Does that work for everybody? All right. So with that, Jeremy, over to you. I'm going to mute.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, everybody. Thank you, Defend Research, for the invitation. So I was an institute director at NIH from 2003 to 2011, and when things started going sideways on January 20th or 21st in 2025, I started hearing from friends inside NIH and then accumulating information and so on, and have been tracking what's going on, particularly data, but also other activities. It's gotten so overwhelming that I used to have 5 slides of the list of all the things that had happened. And one of my NIH friends suggested I just put things on Guernica, which was Picasso's painting from 1937, as the horrors of World War II were starting to unfold. So there have been many things. Certainly censorship is part of it, but there's too numerous to really go through in this period of time, other than to say it's a widespread set of activities, and that is definitely a feature, not a bug. The whole idea is just to overwhelm us with stuff happening as they tear down the scientific enterprise in the U.S. Next slide. So this is just a flow chart of how an idea becomes a grant inside NIH. And the purpose of this is to point out, one, it's a fairly extensive process, been used for many, many years. And it goes through starting with things within the institution, Then there's peer review by outside scientists, experts. The scores get combined. There's a second level review. It eventually goes to funding decisions inside NIH, which formally is made by the institute director with lots of advice from staff. Grants get executed, and normally grants then proceed normally. So this process can be daunting, even if you've been doing it for decades. For early career investigators, it's very confusing. And the next slide shows these are the steps along the way where the administration has disrupted them in some substantial way. So basically, and I've left alone the institution, which has been disrupted as well, but peer review meetings have been disrupted, advisory council meetings have been disrupted, funding recommendation processes have been disrupted, funding decisions have been disrupted, or now may be disrupted even more. Grant execution has been disrupted. Even once an institution gets grants, getting reimbursed from the department, from the treasury, has been disrupted. Non-competing renewals has been disrupted. So it's really been everything that's been done, not in a concerted way, but just sort of one thing after another with a different strategy along the way. And that's caused a lot of chaos and a lot of grants to be in jeopardy, either temporarily or permanently. Next slide. So one of the things, one of the most obvious things that happens is grants that were terminated. So Michael's grant had been awarded, applied for, went through this whole process, got reviewed, got funded, and all of a sudden he got an email saying, your grant's been terminated. Because, I don't know exactly the language, but usually because it no longer aligns with agency priorities, or some other similar sort of broad euphemistic thing saying we just felt like terminating it. A lot of these terminations were around, quote, DEI, which is a term that they use as sort of as a three-letter word, without defining what they actually mean, because when they actually have to defend what they're talking about, it doesn't go so well for them. Transgender and LGBTQ health, vaccine hesitancy, and so on. And as Sarah showed, there have been words that have been sort of blocked and banned and forced to be removed and used for targeting. And on the next slide, one thing, since I love to analyze data, and it's very useful as a scientist and as a communicator to actually have facts that you can show. One of my friends said, we finally got our grant funded, but we had to change the title. And I thought, oh, I can track that because I can look for grants that when they got renewed, the title changed. There's a database, NIH Reporter, where you can track every grant. And I looked, and it turns out that when I did the analysis in the middle of, or late 2025, there were almost 800 grants where the titles had changed. And some of those were typos being corrected, or a few cases typos being introduced. But the main thing I was interested in is what words got removed. So I just took the words that had been removed in the course of this and dumped them into a word cloud generator, and I saw this word cloud, and it was, even though I knew what to expect, it still sort of took my breath away because it was exactly what I expected. So all the things that we'd been talking about, investigators had either been told by NIH, either directly or usually sort of obscurely, that they kind of had need to get rid of these words if they were going to get funded. Or in other cases, they were just complying in advance and saying, I'm going to use a different word to say what I want to do, or change the science that I'm doing because I don't want to get caught up in this. And this was just a very public way of measuring that sort of censorship. Next slide. Another thing which happened, which I'm mentioning just because it's sort of a different sort of censorship, but is also having a big impact, is multi-year funding or fully funding grants. So normally most grants at NIH get funded. If you get a 4-year grant, you get 1 year of funding out of the first fiscal year, the next year of funding, assuming your progress report's acceptable, out of the next fiscal year, and so on and so on. And what NIH started doing at a much higher level than they had in the past is fully funding the grant out of one fiscal year. And that seems like it's not that big a deal. But the consequence is illustrated here. So if you had money to fund 24 grants on an annually funding basis, and you decide to use half the money for multi-year funding, you can then fund 3 grants where you fund all 4 years, and you have 12 grants that you can still make on an annual basis. But that means there are 9 grants that you no longer have the money in that year's appropriation to fund. So that decreases the number of awards that you can make, the number of investigators that can be funded, the number of, the amount of science that can be done, and the cash flow to institutions. So it's a seemingly innocuous thing that really has big impact. And the Office of Management Budget went to the mat actually with a veto threat to say if Congress originally tried to restrict this at previous year's levels, and then they got put in, they can't do more than they did in fiscal year 25 this year, but that's still a huge amount. And next slide, yeah. The consequence of that is shown here. So this is the probability of being funded as a function of percentile score going back to 2015, and the curves are more or less the same. And then 2025 last year, which ended September 30th, you can see all of a sudden things are a lot harder. So there are grants that scored really well, like, between the 10th and 20th percentile, that just weren't funded to any appreciable degree. And one way of framing this, which Stat used, was if you had a grant that was scored at the 10th percentile, so it's the top 10% of all the applications that were submitted, in the past, the chances of being funded were greater than 95%, and last year it was 50-50. And, I think I've had 2 applications over the course of my career that scored at the 10th percentile or better. And, this would be very demoralizing. And I mean, there's a lot of science that's not getting done, and it's preferentially affecting certain topics and certain investigators. Next slide. I think that, yeah. So these are just some resources. One thing which has been pretty disheartening is as Sarah said, the sort of scientific establishment, both in publishing and many scientific societies and most universities and organizations like AAAS, have been pretty quiet and have been watching this happen either quietly or complying in advance. And that has created a need and an opportunity for other groups to step in, mostly run by relatively young people who are just not going to put up with this happening. So these are some of the groups. Stand Up for Science has been particularly effective and had the event yesterday, but they're groups focused on public health, Science Impacts focused on tracking the economic impacts, groups within NIH, Grant and Witness has been tracking terminations, and as Sarah said, I'm busy on Blue Sky and have a sort of dashboard where I try to keep track of some of the things that have been going on, so it's easy for people and reporters and everything else to try to get up to speed on all this craziness. Because occasionally I get a call from a reporter and said, "So what's happened at NIH over the last year?" And it's like, how much time do you have? I will shut up for now.
No, that's a great overview, and I'm so glad you've highlighted all of these groups. I was just pulling up an article from SciAm yesterday that about 100 former astronauts from NASA have come together to just form another group. So I think this is a very typical, experience in kind of these grassroots movements when the institutions, which I think we've learned are weak, are largely norm bound, are very calcified and really showing their inability to flex. Individuals, small groups, grassroots groups fill that void, and I think they're being incredibly effective. I know the Stand Up for Science event yesterday had over 2,000 people on it. So definitely encourage our attendees to engage with these, continue to engage with Defend Research. And Jeremy and Michael are two really useful ways to stay on top of all of this on Blue Sky. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to you, Michael. You've been on the ground, on the front lines, experiencing this in real time. And I think that for those of us who've never submitted a grant, I think I've looked at like what grants look like when they become public online, and it's very overwhelming. It seems incredibly complicated. So for those of us who haven't um, experienced this, really, I just kind of want to put a quarter in the machine and kind of let you go on what this process has been like. And then for you as a public health researcher working on disparities, often in marginalized communities, how has it played out in your experience as an ECR?
No, yeah, totally. Thanks for giving me this opportunity as well. I think it's something that is very complicated in the terms of actually forming the idea and going through all the grant administration steps. But in terms of the practicality of like how much time we have to put into actually receiving an award, executing the science, and eventually getting into the world, I think that's pretty salient and simple for a lot of people to understand. And so you talked about the grant writing process, which I think is an interesting place to start, but I want to take you a little bit earlier, which is me
Yeah,
actually
that's great.
applying for my program. So young Michael Green, I was a senior in undergraduate, and I was thinking about going into public health. We're coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic, this flashpoint moment that I think all of us want to forget. And some of us who are in the head of the NIH want to kind of make it our whole personality still in 2026, but that's another conversation for another day. I saw public health as a space where I can make a very large real world impact. And I was thinking about my own family members and conversations I had with them about their mistrust of kind of traditional Western allopathic medicine. And so
Ooh,
oftentimes a lot of members of my family didn't really feel welcome in healthcare spaces, and they would forego care, miss screenings, all of these
yeah.
things, which would lead to them potentially having more adverse outcomes later on. And so that was kind of the central driving question that I brought into a bunch of different graduate schools when I was applying for PhD programs. I actually, at the time, was admitted to every single program I applied to. And I think that's kind of important to note because this is kind of the North Star for me that I started with. This was the question that was driving my interest because I wanted to change the healthcare system to be more welcoming and open to help my family members ideally be more accepting of kind of this allopathic Western medical era. Fast forward, I'm in my curriculum at my PhD program at Duke, and we had, of course, the methods training that you would need, but we did a lot of
Hmm.
work on thinking about grant writing. And so if we went all the way back to that slide that Jeremy had where we had those different boxes, all of those steps are very complicated to get through. And it's something that all the faculty members, this is something that they have to learn and understand and go through as well. And so big Research One universities, they need to have people who are on staff to deal with award administration, reimbursement for expenses for running experiments, all these things that have kind
So
of
just
built.
to your point there,
Yeah,
there
go
is an
ahead.
entire bureaucratic infrastructure to enable this, right?
Exactly. And
It's
to
not
think,
just, I mean, there are some people who do it on their own, but for the kind of work you do, you guys have teams to help with this.
yeah, and these are staff who are getting employed off of these grants as well. And so you might have the scientists themselves who are submitting the ideas, which is that very first box, but then we're thinking about the research coordinators and the research assistants and the students who are working on these projects. This is kind of an entire ecosystem that is going through this whole process. And so Duke, being a Research One university that takes in hundreds of millions of dollars a year, they thought that it was important for students to understand how to write an NIH grant. And so a lot of our kind of assessments throughout the program are around this. We took courses on it, and I decided back in 2022 that I wanted to apply for a really large NIH fellowship. And so it was the F99 KOO program, which was intended to support both the pre-doctoral stage, so when you're in your PhD, and the postdoctoral stage. And it's funny, I look back at that initial announcement, and the whole purpose was to give you a seamless transition into your postdoctoral position. And so it's one of these new mechanisms that I put out that I only had at a few institutes, and they're hoping to expand to others, where they said, okay, like we want to have some of these areas of research that we want to bring in promising new scholars to. And so it took me honestly probably about 13 months from idea to submission to get my grant into the NIH, which again, this is a lot of time, but I'm waiting in uncertainty. I could have just not gotten a good score, and then the idea is kind of dead in the water, and I need to think about either revising it or maybe moving to some other line of research, or maybe spending more time under my mentor's team pursuing their work. And so yeah, it was a lot of time writing it. I ended up getting a good impact score, and then I was kind of corresponding with the NIH staff after about responding to the summary statement, and then eventually, again, it took 13 months to write it, and then it took about 10 months to receive the award. And so I spent probably around 2-ish years from the thought process of getting the idea all the way to eventually getting that first initial notice of award. And so I received that notice of award in 2024, which is prior to all these changes in January of 2025. And again, I spent this 2-ish years thinking this is something that's going to kind of propel my independent research career to the point of eventually, hopefully, going on to apply for a faculty position, again, to work on my North Star of thinking about making healthcare more accepting. Of course, Jeremy brought up the unfortunate thing about the grant situation. And I do want to kind of put a caveat next to it, is that I did not just get an outright termination notice. I got a request to renegotiate my work, which is within line of this research censorship kind of concept that we're trying to cover here, where
Michael,
some
can I pause
people
you there
go
and
ahead. Yeah,
can
go
I
ahead.
pick up a little there? So, you've spent 2 years, you have a grant, and then the new administration comes in, NIH gets new leadership, and then like, did you think, oh, my stuff might be at risk? Like, was it just business as usual, and then you just got a notification from NIH, or were you kind of thinking that
So
this might actually like the political change may impact what I can do?
pretty immediately, I thought I was going to be at
Yeah.
risk. I
Okay.
because of although the study itself was not just only surrounding Black adults. Black adults was in the title because the hypothesis was that based on this prior experience, that they might be more likely to be more mistrusting of the healthcare system, or they might face adverse outcomes because of perception there. And so again, this is a hypothesis, not the actual study where we analyze it across all racial and gender groups, which is a whole other conversation for another day in terms of the how slapdash some of the terminations and renegotiation requests were, because the tools that were used to actually identify what is a quote unquote DEI
Mm,
award, it was done amongst people who are not experts. And so not only were they not experts, there were also no formal definition around these things, or a definition that is legally consistent across all these different awards. And so I was immediately afraid when I just had friends who maybe in March, their grants were terminated just immediately because they were in a program like a diversity supplement award, or in a different specific NIH fellowship program where it was targeted to recruit certain groups to diversify the biomedical workforce. And so their project might not even have to do anything with a topic like my own, which is, again, a whole other kind of circumstance where people are being targeted purely for their identity. And then in my case, it's because of the research I'm doing. And so we're kind of paying a dual tax there, where I think people who are in a certain socially constructed category, they're getting targeted. And then also people
hmm
who are doing research that is trying to examine some of these phenomena are also getting targeted. And there's even some people who they might have accidentally had the word equity, but then they said private equity, which is not has nothing to do with their actual
Right.
equity in science, eventually getting stripped from their grants and holding up funds. And so I'm saying all this to say that I spent a lot of time thinking about my project itself. I spent a lot of time thinking about who are the people who are going to review my work, because not
hmm
everybody prior to 2025 accepted that this was a serious scientific question. And so I spent a lot of time with the faculty and with the curriculum we had to do, trying to think about how we frame this question in both a testable way, in a way that would have public health benefit. And so the confusion for me started when I was trying to correspond with the NIH folks. And so this is like not blaming them at all, but they're not being given clear instructions, or even being the ones who are initiating necessarily the renegotiations or the terminations of awards. And so me as an early career investigator, and this is my first NIH fellowship grant ever. And this is, again, something that I'm being told it's going to be foundational to my career to interact with these different government research organizations to support the science that is going to hopefully bring positive change into the world. And so prior to 2025, the NIH program staff are very friendly, very open, and their words are
Hmm.
consistent with their actions. Where if I asked the question about what are the institutional priorities, they had very clear language around that and could direct me to documents around what they wanted to see. If I asked them about how I assemble a certain document within a grant, again, they see this as a training moment and bringing in scientists who are trying to think about um, what is going to develop me as a scholar and help, again, the general public. Now I'm asking simple questions like, hey, my grant was called it said it had DEI activities in it. Well, the research question was not a DEI question because we analyzed everyone. Can we get any follow-up? For some reasons, I'm guessing because they were told not to speak to it, but I never really got directly the answer on that. I wasn't given any specifications. And so that is what brought me to this point where I was hoping to have this seamless transition to my postdoctoral position, because again, that's the whole point of the F99 KOO. I was in limbo where I was waiting about 6-ish months after I requested to get the second part of my funds to bring me into my next institution, a position which we was kind of contingent upon this funding. You can't really support a postdoc with no money, which again is why the NIH created this thing to create this seamless transition forward. And then for the second time in 6 months, I was told, hey, this is a DEI project. And nope, we can't tell you what exactly is what's wrong with it. And so I think that there's so much chaos in this whole process where you're being told you need to kind of adopt this system of forming a good question, interacting with these people in the federal government, and then eventually they're going to help you enable your science to push it forward. And now it's honestly it's almost like I don't want to make light of this. It's like a traumatic relationship where you're like I'm trying to like work with the people who are I'm being told are supposed to help me, and all I'm getting is instability, lost salary, and then abrupt kind of harmful movement to my career while also kind of doing this independently with my mentor. Because again, the schools aren't really necessarily providing the infrastructure for you to protect yourself in these moments. And they're also telling you, hey, we're on a hiring freeze right now. If you want to come in, we got it. You have to find a way to fund your work either way, regardless of the situation. And so that's kind of builds me to this point of being like, I am an optimist by nature. I think all scientists need to be optimistic. I've been spending more of my time thinking about advocacy and thinking about, I'm kind of just plainly speaking about how my work is done and what we're losing out on when we add all these wrenches into the kind of path of researchers like myself going forward. But I think we also need to be really frank about who is being harmed here. In that word cloud, of the people or of the topics that are being kind of removed from the NIH pool of the grant portfolio, even if people are still trying to find ways to kind of do some of this work, that doesn't mean that these issues are just being eliminated entirely. And so the NIH, and Jeremy could speak to this as well, made a lot of these words or combinations of words that are in this word cloud priority areas because they were really important health questions. We were lagging in some of these different health disparities areas, and we wanted to find a way to ideally target some of these different issues and then find ways to improve the care of people or the general public health of people going forward. And so I think that what I am kind of also prioritizing now at this stage is if the thesis is that all of those words and all this type of science and all these programs were not solving health disparities, I kind of pass it back to NIH leadership and those who are justifying these types of actions to say, well, what is your solution? What is this? What are the stats that are behind this? What are the data that justify throwing all these people's careers into this array? Because I even think about the priority research areas that are being claimed to be important for people, whether it be nutrition science or it is, novel AI interventions or
Right.
thinking about
Yeah.
some of these different policy priorities. I'm not seeing any data that supports that either. Talk to a nutrition scientist. Talk to Kevin Hall,
Hmm.
who's been on a few different media um, appearances recently, talking about how his work was outright censored, and that there was kind of no way to move forward with his really innovative work that was intramurally within the NIH infrastructure. You would think that's someone who would want to be elevated or promoted. And so I'm saying I'll kind of wrap up by saying we are in this period of uncertainty, but I know that health issues are kind of inevitable. And so if
Hmm.
that's where we are, how do we move forward?
Let me, can I jump in real quick?
Yeah, please go ahead, Jeremy. Yeah.
One thing, with both in terms of censorship and in terms of, a communications challenge, I'm in touch with a lot of NIH staff people, and they have, their normal, if you're an NIH program officer, a lot of your job description is interacting with applicants and grantees and trying to help them navigate the process and make their science, the best it can be and aligned with NIH goals and so on. And, the first thing that happened, which was on January 20th, 2025, was there a communications freeze, and they weren't allowed to talk to anybody about anything. And, they've been very frustrated because they want to help people like Michael a lot, and they're being told you can help him, but you can't give him any information, even if you think you know it, because we're just trying to be coy about this, and we don't want to say anything that's going to be problematic in litigation or whatever. So you just sort of say, it's DEI. Well, what do you mean by that? It's like, sorry, I can't help you. Um, so one of the things I've struggled with is, complaining about NIH, meaning the NIH leadership, versus complaining about NIH,
The
meaning
staff.
the
Yeah.
career staff who are
Yeah.
in
Who are
agony
just
a
as
lot of
much
the
in
time.
disarray. Yeah. Yeah. I live just outside of DC, and you go to the playground and you inevitably run into parents who are NIST employees, NIH employees, and they're sharing all the same stories that they desperately want to respond to Michael's email. And not only can they not respond, even if they could, there's nothing that they can say because they're as in the dark half the time, uh, as much as the researchers are. So I appreciate that distinction. I think it's really really important. Something I wanted to come back to, and we do have some questions in the Q&A, so I'm going to make sure I don't lose sight of those. And please keep them coming. I've been trying to monitor the chat and the Q&A as well. One of the questions I wanted to ask you both, and this is going to come up in our subsequent webinars in the rest of the summer, is one of the things you're looking at, Jeremy, is are people changing the words, right? How are they working around the system? Michael, for the kind of research you do, is that even possible? And Jeremy, to what extent, based on the analysis you've been doing, can you tell if working the system, so not changing what the core research is about, but fiddling with words, with phrasing to just get it through the sensors, to what extent is that working? So, Michael, if you want to go first, and then maybe Jeremy can jump in.
Totally. Yeah. So actually, another thing that'd be helpful, if we could go back to that flow chart that Jeremy
Sure.
put
Yeah.
up, I think that would be very helpful for kind of illustrating my point here. So again, where I was in my process, where I was asked to change all these different words and all that, was at the very last box. And so that was that means I got through all the other steps prior to that to get to there. And so the issue
Wow.
of multi-year funding that Jeremy brought up, I think that's even more existential than censorship because people just aren't getting awards. And so if you have this higher competitive and higher success rate landscape, that's issue number one. You're not funding scholars, especially early career people who might have thinner CVs, less preliminary data, whatever. Like the whole way that we kind of distribute awards to scholars is being thrown in jeopardy because of these accounting tricks, mostly coming from Russ Vought and the Office of Management Budget. So that's the first part there. Now, I see my situation. There are plenty of temporary band-aids you can go to, but again, how long do you have until you need to get your next grant? Again, part of the kind of life of a biomedical researcher, you're thinking about what's the next project. How do you advance your science? How do you keep your team funded? And so there's also kind of conflicting advice out there about whether or not you should preemptively self-censor. I think if I preemptively self-censor, my grant for the most part is like dead in the water. Because what are you describing? I think that it's a very specific phenomenon that I care about, which is discrimination faced in healthcare settings. It can be against a whole bunch of different people, but sometimes that hypothesis might not be justified for some over the others. And so some people, they are preemptively self-censoring, and then they turn in a proposal, which it might not even get a good score, it might not get through review, because what are you looking at? Why is there no specificity here? And so I think for people in my shoes or people who are thinking about getting their research program started, you're in a kind of dual quagmire where you're like, well, do I Do I self-censor? Oh, it's super competitive, so I should be really specific and have a body of work here. And so, long way of saying, I think that so many people are handling this situation differently. And it kind of feels like it's kind of the point. You came in and you terminated all these grants, you riffed a bunch of staff, and then now there's central communication, which is not putting out anything helpful to people. And so I think everyone's just kind of being forced into making personal judgments. I personally think people should
Yeah.
still submit NIH grants and should still pursue, strong empirical research questions, things that are backed by a bunch of literature that, even if it's harder to get out in the post 2025 landscape, there's still a ton of great evidence out there that you can work with. But I think that, like, needless to say, just the way that we've kind of been put in this position where there's more competition and the incentive to even do this work, where you might get to the point of getting an award in a grant, and then now you have all
Mm.
these new post-award administration procedures. I think that there are far more disincentives now to pursue some of these things, but that doesn't mean they're not valuable. Because again, I think that science is important and thinking about future is important.
So, so I would say, I'm doing more sophisticated analysis, rather than just a word cloud. And a lot of what's going on is basically an exercise in euphemisms. That
Mm.
is, rather than saying, um, black health disparities, there are terms that are being put in that are, um, variable outcomes among specific populations or something, where you just sort of avoid anything that's specific. And, a lot of this is sort of aligned with the whole censorship movement about the history of slavery and other sorts of things, that somehow you know, the white community can't, is made to feel bad if they're told that there was a time in the United States when Africans were, enslaved, and that was done by white people. So rather than teaching history and saying, not our proudest moment in the course of history, they're saying, yeah, let's just sort of pretend that that didn't happen because it makes us feel bad. So I think there's a lot of that that's going on, which is kind of good news and bad news. I think the good news is, I think a lot of the research is still going ahead. The bad news is, just from a sort of Orwellian perspective, it's just changing language as a way of being less clear in what you're talking about, which is not helpful. Um,
No, no. I actually want to pull up. Rosario had a question early on in the conversation that I'll just read out here and we can answer live. With review of terms that have been removed from grant language, I noticed health and disparity showed up very prominently. Was it a single term, health disparity? The removal of disparity is surprising, but did health independently get removed from proposals? And Michael, I'd be interested, in answering Rosario's question, if you can speak to, like, were you told that there were words that were triggering this renegotiation, or was it just like we've flagged you and we can't tell you why?
so it's mostly health disparities as a term. I mean, as I said, this was the quick and dirty way of looking at things, of just dumping things into a word cloud generator, which doesn't keep phrases together. So a lot of the things are actually, if you did the same thing with 2 word or 3 word phrases, you would see more specific terms. One crazy thing about the way this has evolved within NIH is there is now an AI system that's being used by NIH to screen applications for whether they're problematic or not. And the way that was generated was, even inside NIH, it was so unclear what the basis was for the decisions. It was all being done by Doge, and then by
I was going to say, was that the child
some
of the Doge work?
some of it was Doge, and some of it was somebody somewhere outside NIH, and no one really knows for sure. Some of it's with HHS, some of it's somewhere else. So um, there was a informatics type within NIH who basically wrote trained a machine learning system to take these are all the grants that got flagged by this black box out there that's messing with us, and we just want to train a system so it can tell us which grants are going to get flagged in advance. So they've sort of reverse engineered their own system to try to figure out what
What
they have
the
done.
guidance is
Yeah,
that's
and
driving
so
the flagging.
it's
Yeah.
very, by its nature, it's very obscure because, the director has said there are no such things as banned words. And that's sort of formally true because it's not like they started off with banned words. They're just words that got flagged, which they subsequently figured out those are the words that are problematic. So it's not like they came up with a list a priori.
So
So,
something that both of you have is related to one of the anonymous questions that I'd like to get to next. Before we wrap up with Jean's question, just looking as usual, the time flies. So my apologies. Um, you know, you are both describing instances that are very much like baby with a basket of grenades. And then you're also describing instances where like someone very thoughtful like Russ Vogt, right, has built very kind of nuanced thoughtful structures to make sure that certain political outcomes are the result of what happens. And so from your experience, Michael, as a just a researcher trying to make a living, doing work they believe in that will hopefully make the world a better place. Are you experiencing it on what end of the spectrum are you and other researchers experiencing? It's because it's hard to know. Are we dealing with a baby with a hand grenade, or actually is this deeply thought out and insidious because it's so well thought out? I'm curious where you're
Yeah.
landing there in your experience.
Yeah, great. These are great questions, and it depends. I think both could be happening at the same time because I think they're both
Yeah,
are. And I
yeah,
think that
sure.
especially from the perspective of the sophisticated like planning side of it, I think you can have that as the overarching plan and then chaos be the driver of that plan. And so I think about
And chaos is probably one of the goals in some
yeah.
ways,
And
right?
so
Yeah.
for me personally, I can think of again saying there's no banned words and saying that like even people who are there, I know people who've gone through multiple renegotiations at the same checkpoint, which again, there's no transparency on what is getting flagged specifically. Okay, as a researcher, you're going to waste your time guessing or removing words from certain parts of your bio sketch to get things through. And it's like, this is ultimately a waste of everyone's time. But again, if you have this overarching goal, of whatever Russ was saying in terms of like crippling the federal workforce or terrifying them or whatever, that could also be the practical reality where you're still going to have this kind of moment of attrition in these different institutions among these certain research areas, whatever. And so for me, I think that it's clearly whatever's going on is working because I'm losing colleagues. There's less places hiring. We're
Yeah.
losing staff members at all these research universities. And I understand entirely how the initial reaction is, okay, well, maybe if we put our head down on this just for a few months, like we'll be able to get through this. But you're not facing the reality of how do you get your workforce to keep coming in every day and
You're right.
believe in the future of science if you're not at least giving them guidance on what you do care about. I almost would have had more respect for a lot of research leaders, institutions if they're like leaned into it and said, "Yeah, we don't want this. We don't want this type of work. We're going to do this at
Well, it's
blank
easier.
university."
It's more
Yeah, because
clear. It's
but
more clear.
now
It's
what
yeah.
exactly? What's even worse is it's so passive where it's kind of like, okay, we're don't make sure you don't have your institutional name on anything you go out and say. Where I'm like, you're still kind of getting screwed regardless.
Oh
Like
yeah. I
yeah,
mean,
for
I,
my colorful language, and
if you
so
haven't read the Kafka's The Castle, this is really making me think of that, and I think that's very much the point.
yeah, I'm
We're getting close to time, so Jeremy, keep it brief, and then I'll.
very, very quickly. The other thing, so NIH is 27 different institutes and centers, and keeping them coordinated is a lot of work. That's
Mhm.
not its natural state. It silos like any other organization. So creating chaos is easy. You basically just stop trying to communicate, and chaos will ensue. Institutes will do their own thing. They will do different things. They'll confuse themselves. They'll confuse researchers. So I think there is an overarching plan, but I think a lot of it is just, throwing some hand grenades and just letting nature take its course, and then you could sort of see where you are and realize you have to tweak things if you want to get back on your sort of evil plan if it's
Yeah,
drifting.
I think that's a really good framework. You to the question about the speakers and defend researchers' take on the OMB regulations that came out last week, which they always come out on a Friday, so you can really stress over the weekend. Um, That's right. You have a macro plan that's very well thought out, and then you have a bunch of literal children throwing the grenades, and you get the effect that you want on both the micro and the macro level, which makes a lot of sense. Yeah, briefly, I would love, Lisa and speakers, either of you, if you wish to comment on on the OMB proposal, on the call for comment, and we can certainly, as part of our follow up to the webinar, circulate some resources for folks who want to engage with that question more. Lisa, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I'll be really brief. I think actually Jeremy and Michael touched on this at the beginning that the OMB proposed regulations are horrific. It's an emergency call to action, which is why Stand Up for Science had that call. I'm so happy to see that UCS has a call today, and that information is in the chat. We are getting the word out about this as part of Defend Research. One thing I want to bring into this is this affects all fields. I mean, there's a lot of focus on STEM, but this is about everything. And so it's across the board. And what it's doing is, I think, formalizing, as Jeremy said earlier, this was sort of happening before, but this is formalizing it. It's trying to entrench it. It's trying to make it harder to change and remove. So we need everybody to come together and really fight this. What we're doing on our part is to promote all the actions that other organizations are putting out there. We're going to be sharing resources in an email that's going to go out soon. If you want to sign up for our newsletter, we share resources all the time. And we're planning on having weekly action hours through June to help support people writing comments on and submit those and making calls. And we're pulling together all the resources from everybody else to help with that, including Jeremy's template, which he shared on Blue Sky. UCS has some resources, Stand Up for Science has resources. So that's where we stand. It's time. There's no time to be silent, as I say all the time.
Well, so
Okay, Jeremy, Michael, you each get 30 seconds. Go.
so just a quick strategic thing, which is the purpose of commenting is not to convince Russ Vought that he's wrong,
Okay,
because
right.
that's
Right.
obviously a fool's errand, because he's sure he's right. But if they're if no one commented, well, comments are useful because after things happen, you can then sue if they have to respond to comments legally. So if they don't respond adequately to good faith comments that were made, then that can be the subject for litigation. So don't be discouraged that I need to convince somebody of somebody. You just need to make the case, and it's there for the lawyers later on to build cases around.
That's a great point, Jeremy. Thank you. Michael.
Yeah, and I'll end us on a hopeful note where it's like, even though all of this craziness has happened, all the career harm, I have so many people who have like been through so much in the course of what has been like about a year and a half, I guess now, which feels like it's been a whole decade of my career at this point. I think that there's still a ton of great science to be done. And so if you believe in that, you need to be thinking about future reforms to both re-entice the people who were pushed out either
Hmm.
unlawfully or because they were just considered useless federal workers, which is incorrect. Think about how you're going to re-entice those people. How are you going to encourage researchers like myself, who was told 3 years ago that this is a way to kind of provide future career stability, and now I had to go through, 4 or 5 months of no paychecks, waiting on the NIH to tell me whether or not my woke DEI science is worthy of moving forward or not. You need to think about how do we re-entice people to continue to do the good work that I think we've done a ton of in America, and we still have a future we're going to keep doing that. But that doesn't start with being passive. It starts with action. It starts with kind of the data to back up why you want to invest in those programs. And so I'm hopeful about the future of science. I know a lot of people who are still fighting the good fight, and I think that a lot of people have some things to do, and we've given them a ton of tasks they can.
We have a lot of work to do. That's exactly right. And Jean, your question about, what are the most effective ways of mobilizing? Well, again, defendresearch.org, we have links to all of the groups that are doing this work: Union for Concerned Scientists, Stand Up for Science, many of the others. So if you want to see things that you can do, remember that there are many things you can do. So the thing I like to leave folks with is like, despair is a privilege. Feeling helpless, feeling exhausted, like those are all things that are the point of what this administration is trying to do. You cannot give in to them, and you have to remember that every small thing you do makes a difference. I always point to this quote from James C. Scott's Weapons of the Week, because I think it really is noteworthy when thinking about the work that we're doing. To Michael's point around concrete things to do to really move the needle, we're very excited that our next two webinars are going to be with the two of the co-authors of the Anti-Autocracy Handbook, A Scholar's Guide to Navigating Democratic Backsliding. And we're really going to unpack the questions of, when does self-censorship to get a grant through start sliding into complicity, right? What do I, as a researcher, where are my red lines around things I'm willing to change and things I shouldn't change? So Steve will be talking from the kind of theoretical perspective. This is a free book you can get online. Vera is going to be actually talking about doing that work as a refugee researcher coming to the United States. So Jeremy, Michael, the work of our group, the work of many others, it's all featured on our site. Please do plan to join us for webinars in the rest of the summer. And just remember that every little piece helps. So you can start today. You can start with something small, and we will see you July 15th for our next webinar. My huge thanks to Jeremy and Michael for their time and their expertise. Follow them on Blue Sky. There are some of the best resources out there in terms of raising voices. Keep up the fight, and we will see you next month, July 15th. Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Jeremy, Michael. Have a great rest of your day.